Today, Russia looks like this. Tomorrow, might it look like this? Yes, the war is straining domestic relations inside of the Federation, and it will only get worse once the war ends, even if things go relatively well for Ukraine. So, on today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline, we consider the breakup of Russia. Let's imagine that the Ukraine war ends poorly for the Kremlin. What are the chances that the country breaks apart afterward, similar to the fall of the Soviet Union or 1990s Yugoslavia? Is there any evidence that Ukraine supports or should support separatist factions? Yes, the Russia is done genre of YouTube videos. Not to be outdone, of course, by Ukraine's own trolling by recognizing Chechnya as temporarily occupied. Somehow I have successfully avoided the topic for 4 years. I have run a handful of marathons in my life, but I suppose there was no outrunning this one. So yeah, I guess we'll talk about it right now. Let me start with my blunt answer, and then I will pivot to some nuance. I think this genre exists because it chases clicks. It appeals to the large audience that always wants good news out of the Ukraine war, no matter what is happening on the ground. It is only second to the Putin is done genre in terms of how disconnected from reality it is. Both start with laying out a series of reasonable facts, but then lose the plot by ignoring how the actors involved have agency and will work to stop outcomes that they do not like. For those of you who have mercifully avoided ever seeing one of these videos, the basic premise is that Russia is a federation. It is literally the name of the country, the Russian Federation. The European side is politically and culturally dominant, but there is an endless stream of ethnic groups out east. We normally only hear about them when discussing Russia's recent military recruitment scheme. We rarely see any of them because few are involved in Russia's national political affairs. Former Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu is the notable exception. Still, these peripheral regions have political opinions, which range from ambivalence to outright opposition to Moscow. Give some or most the opportunity, and they will sprint to independence. Well, the preface to the question assumes the opportunity has arisen. Russia is beaten back on the battlefield. Fill in the rest of the details as you see fit. Logistics are completely shattered in Zaporizhia. Ukraine drives to the coast of the Sea of Azov. Crimea, under siege, eventually breaks. Political chaos spreads in Moscow as ordinary Russians must confront the inadequacies of their government. The discontent spreads to the periphery, which never was particularly interested in Moscow's politics. Keep extrapolating from there. I do not want to comment on the likelihood that any of these premises are true, because that is not the point of this video. Rather, I want to analyze the argumentation you will see in regard to the breakdown of the Russian Federation, which often takes the form of Phase 1, periphery dissatisfaction, Phase 2, Phase 3, independence. The irony of this genre of videos is that they often understate just how bad the problem is for the central government. Simultaneously, though, without a theory for how you get from dissatisfaction to independence, you do not have a coherent argument. Let's start with the deeper structural issues. Ever since the Kremlin's mobilization efforts from the fall of 2022 turned into a political fiasco, the Russian army has focused on recruitment via voluntary contracts, a market wage in exchange for labor, just like any other job. If you think about who is most likely to assume an extraordinary risk of bodily harm for some money, it will be the poor and desperate. Those types of individuals disproportionately come from the periphery, which is why recruitment rates skew disproportionately east. Too often from here, the conversation devolves into a discussion about dissatisfaction. The war will eventually end. These soldiers will return home, and they will be so disenchanted with Moscow that they will then try to force a separation from the government. There are a handful of problems with that theory. 1. It presupposes that the central government had previously thrilled those living in the periphery, which is questionable. 2. It misunderstands the nature of voluntary contracts. I am sure that some individuals did not understand the true danger that they were assuming by deploying to Ukraine. But rather than chalking up recruitment to massive naivete lasting years, The system more plausibly reflects the very poor financial position that many families on the periphery have lived under. These Ministry of Defense contracts have been a financial windfall to those regions. A bloody one, but a windfall nonetheless. 3. Much of that windfall has come from individuals simply working in factories, who have benefited from the influx in demand for labor, and would have no direct qualms about the war. And 4th, the majority of those returning home from the war will have effectively won a lottery. They took up a contract that paid a risk premium. Those that survived in one piece spun the wheel, and got the benefit without having to suffer the potential cost. The irony of focusing on disgruntled war vets is that it overlooks a more fundamental problem that the Kremlin will encounter. You just spent the last few years training people on the periphery in modern warfare. They have been applying those lessons to fight Kyiv, but nothing stops them from turning around and using them against Moscow. Furthermore, this is the type of thing that will happen regardless of the war outcome. So much of the Russia is done genre is predicated on the war going poorly. But these vets will be returning home one way or another with greater bargaining power. The Kremlin will have to deal with this problem even if all of eastern Ukraine is part of Russia by the end of the war. And all of this is happening while the periphery is getting richer. It is much easier to ignore the periphery when it is poor. But with the wealth transfer east, political power inherently comes with it. From here, this is supposed to lead to the inevitable fragmentation of and revolution in the Russian Federation. But if we as a group have learned anything from the last 4 years of content, it is that discontent and military power do not explain why wars occur. Rather, discontent and military power dictate the terms of settlement. The stronger you are, the better you can do in negotiations because you can force outcomes closer to your ideal world. The more you are generally angry, the less you internalize the costs of war, the better you do in negotiations because you can credibly fight if offered paltry concessions. Stories of separatist groups and revolutions make for more interesting headlines, so it is very easy to cite all of the problems that can come up in civil conflicts. And indeed, certainly there are a lot of civil wars ongoing in the world. But what is far more common are regions within countries receiving an autonomous or semi-autonomous status. Essentially, they stay within the country but receive special rights or privileges. There are a couple that you are likely already familiar with. Kurdistan in northern Iraq is exactly that, a region that has its own government of sorts, but is still ultimately subject to Baghdad. More relevant to today's topic is Crimea. It was autonomous when it was a part of Ukraine, and it de facto became an autonomous part of Russia following the 2014 annexation. In fact, the Russian Federation is full of these autonomous regions. Again, that is why it is a federation. Now, how much autonomy these regions have in practice has varied over the years. During the height of Soviet power, not so much. Following the end of the Cold War, a lot more. Under the democratic decline overseen by Putin, less so. What we are essentially discussing here is the outcome of coercive bargaining. It is just internal to a state rather than between states. And everything from our earlier conversation is telling us that the post-Ukraine war environment will allow those republics to wrest greater autonomy from Moscow. Not full independence, Russia will not be that weakened, just greater autonomy. Perhaps a few more will demand autonomous recognition and obtain it for the first time. That is not the Russian Federation breaking apart as the genre normally sees it. But the weaker the Russian government is internally, the weaker it also is on the international stage. It is just that the baseline expectation should not be as chaotic as is usually imagined. Of course, that is a baseline expectation. We all know that bargaining frictions can lead to bargaining failures, and the wars that start as a result. No doubt we could come up with stories for why bargaining frictions could arise here. And if they do pop up, you could get civil wars, and the successful movements might become independent states. But the point is that a weakened central government does not immediately imply civil war. One final point to stay true to the original question. Ukraine is not taking many public actions to directly encourage these uprisings, beyond the aforementioned trolling involving Chechnya. It feeds a domestic Russian narrative that any internal grievances are purely the result of Ukrainian agitators. However, there sure is a lot that Ukraine is doing to indirectly have that effect. I am not just referring to strikes on Russia's economic interests here. I mean the general campaign to disrupt war infrastructure in the greater Moscow region. People living in Moscow are kind of stuck with whatever government controls the Kremlin. People in far-flung regions of Russia have more choice. One day, they might stop playing ball. Meanwhile, one day I might fail to prepare a video. But this was not the day. Enjoy the back catalog of these Geopolitics Helpline videos while I continue to extend the streak. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.